All right, welcome back, everybody. As we continue our coverage of the Joseph Ray Daniels trial, right now we're joined by a very special guest. Mr. Daniels' defense attorney, Jake Lockert, joins us. Mr. Lockert, great to have you here on Law&Crime.
Good to be here.
So it's been a fascinating trial to watch. A lot of twists, a lot of turns. I want to start with the verdict. Came over on the weekend, and we were surprised here by the way this actually was broken down. I'm curious what your reaction to the verdict was and what your team's reaction was to the verdict.
Well, I can't say that we were completely surprised, since they did bring in a alleged live witness kind of at the last minute. Prior to the trial, we had no information that a brother was going to be testifying. Once the brother testified, it made it clear that the jury could reach a verdict like they did. So I can't say I'm surprised. I'm glad they did not find my client guilty of premeditated murder.
You're talking, of course, about Alex. And, you know, what was interesting about Alex's testimony is that, you know, your client said on tape, Alex is a good boy, he doesn't lie. And yet, the goal was to say that Alex was not credible. What did you make of Alex's testimony?
Well, his testimony was a complete change from where it was after this alleged murder took place. After it took place, in his interviews, he did not appear to be distressed or upset. In no way indicated that he had watched a murder take place, and was calm and just acting like an 8-year-old kid at that time. And his information at the time was that my client did not do anything wrong. He did not see my client kill Joe Clyde Daniels. And he came into the bedroom at 5:30 and woke him up to get him up to help him look for Joe Clyde Daniels. So I think his testimony is interesting in that they didn't come up with it for 3 years. The weaknesses in the state's case prior to Alex were, as you know, there was no blood evidence at the scene or in the vehicle that indicated Joe Clyde Daniels had been beaten or killed. My client, in his confession, said that he had taken the body in the trunk of a car and took it to a location, concealed it, then drove back home and got in bed around midnight. We know from neighbor security video that my client's car never left during that time. We know there was no blood at that time. So the only type testimony the state could bring in that would meet those weaknesses was to have this child come in and testify that he saw my client kill Joe Clyde Daniels, picked him up, and rather than put him in one of the two cars there or the truck to take the body off, that he simply picked him up and carried a 65-pound child down the yard onto a public roadway that's a high traffic roadway and walked down the road carrying the child away. Mm-hmm. We find that to be unbelievable, but it does meet the weaknesses that the state had in their case at that time.
Are you suggesting Alex wasn't telling the truth on the stand? And if that's the case, why do you think he wasn't telling the truth?
Well, he's lived in placement with some guardians. He's been interviewed or had therapy sessions some 50 times. When you watch his initial interviews, you can see the child advocacy workers are trying to get him to say that Joseph killed Joe Clyde. So I suspect for the past 3 years, there have been people trying to get him to say that. And also seeing the discovery in the case and the motion hearings and my client's confession, which has been on YouTube previously, he had an opportunity to come up with a story that met the weaknesses in the state's case. And I just don't believe that. I do not believe him. If you've ever picked up a 50-pound bag of concrete doing yard work and carried it any length of time, you would realize how implausible it is that someone would carry a 65-pound kid, holding them out in their arms like this, and walk down a public roadway that's a high traffic roadway and nobody see anything. Mr. Daniel McCormick had testified earlier in the trial, and just the 30 seconds that he was in that area, he saw 3 other vehicles. So I find Alex's story to not be credible at all, but apparently the jury accepted it.
Well, in the closings, there was a suggestion that Alex might have been the one who's responsible for the death of baby Joe. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, there were at least 2 prior instances where Alex had attacked Joe Clyde Daniels. In one of those instances, the family had to take Joe Clyde to the hospital. So what I'm saying is the person you saw on the stand in this trial, Alex at 11 years old, is not the real Alex.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he'd assaulted this child, we know at least on 2 occasions. One, they had to take the child to the hospital. And what I'm suggesting is that he, over the course of 3 years, had people working with him, telling him what to say. And finally, they were able to get him to come up with a story that explained the weaknesses in the state's case.
Mr. Locker, when we talk about strategy, a lot of us were surprised that the defense didn't call any witnesses, maybe to expand on this idea that Alex is really responsible or that your client provided a false confession. How come no witnesses were called by the defense?
At the end of the state's proof, we knew that they had another close to 28 rebuttal witnesses. And we simply were concerned that if we put on any proof, the state would put on another 28 witnesses to talk about things my client had said, phone calls he'd made, that would be very damaging. And so we chose to cut the state's proof off by not putting on proof ourselves.
Can you expand on that, on what you were concerned about coming in? Because we're all trying to understand exactly what happened to baby Joe at the end of the day.
Well, as far as that strategy, when you know the state has another 20 or so witnesses and they've got recorded phone calls, letters from my client, that type thing, it's damaging. Our position was our client was convinced in the confession that he had killed Joe Clyde Daniels, which is called a false internalized confession. So we believe that law enforcement convinced him that he had done this. They convinced him that Alec had seen it, and so he adopted their theory. And as he went through, law enforcement told him that someone's phone had left the house. So he said that he took Crystal's phone. That was a way of protecting Crystal, but also conforming to the information they'd given him. They also told him they know that someone had left the house with Joe Clyde Daniels. So he adopted the police information into his confession and said that he took him away in the maroon car. So every little thing that the police gave him, he adopted into his confession. And other examples of why that's a false internalized confession, law enforcement had advised that Daniel McCormick, the witness who saw Joe Clyde Daniels on the roadway, had stopped at the Love's truck stop and bought a Dr. Pepper. Well, the next thing you know, our client's calling law enforcement to come talk to him again, and he tells him the man in Love's that bought the Diet Dr. Pepper was him. So he just adopted facts. He knew somebody had stopped at Love's and bought a Dr. Pepper. We now know it was Daniel McCormick, but our client believed that was him, so he told the TBI, that was me. I stopped and got a Dr. Pepper before I hauled my child's body off to conceal it.
I guess the confusion is, your client was he voluntarily provided this information to law enforcement. He called them up, told them to, go back to check his trunk. Why was he so forthcoming with police? Why did he voluntarily speak with them?
Well, he was extremely susceptible to authority figures, and he had a history based on his mental illness of being susceptible to people telling him things. When he was in high school, students in the high school had him convinced that he had a girl pregnant that he'd never had sexual relations with. And because of his mental illness, he's very suggestible. And so over the course of over 4 hours, law enforcement was able to suggest to him, you killed Joe Clyde, you took the body away in a vehicle, and you took a phone with you. So he comes up with this story, I killed Joe Clyde, I took him away in a vehicle, and I took my wife's cell phone to use as a flashlight to get rid of the body. It's a completely fabricated and imaginary story. And he continued to tell him as he went through, I'm speculating on what I did. I'm trying to remember what I did. And the TBI agent even asked him at one time, Joseph, are you making this up or did it really happen? So it was a completely unbelievable confession. And the only way the state could have got a conviction in this case was to come up with a witness that would explain the weaknesses in their proof. And the only way to explain that our client didn't haul the body off on the car was to have someone testify that he carried him off by hand. And that's just absurd. That's a public roadway. You don't walk down that road carrying a 65-pound dead child in your arm and people not see it. So it's completely absurd, but the jury accepted it.
But why the inconsistencies? I mean, we know that there was this conversation he had with his father where he said Crystal was the killer. In his talks with law enforcement, he said that he beat Baby Joe, then locked him outside of the house. At one point, Baby Joe walked off on his own. There's these different stories from your client. Why?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, if you have become convinced that you killed Joe Clyde Daniels, but the reality is you didn't, then you continue to try to speculate on what may have happened or how it happened. So yes, you'll say you beat him to death, or you'll say I ran him outside the house. Little by little, he's trying to give law enforcement what they want, and when he says he ran him outside the house, that's not enough. So they move him more, and he says, yeah, I beat him to death and carried him out and concealed the body. Keep in mind that in his confession, he said he killed the child, took it in the trunk of the car, concealed the body, and then came back and got in bed around midnight and went to sleep. We now know that Daniel McCormick saw a person meeting Joe Clyde Daniels' description at 1:45 in the morning. If Daniel McCormick saw Joe Clyde Daniels out there standing on the side of the road, then he cannot be dead and concealed in the woods somewhere.
So what is the defense's theory on what happened to Baby Joe at the end of the day? Where is he?
We have no idea where he is. I think either he was struck by a driver. There were no shoulders on this roadway. I think someone maybe have hit him, panicked, picked the body up and carried it off, or he was abducted because no body was found anywhere in the area. And likewise, you'll notice that TBI had cell phone records, location records, and they didn't have any evidence that would point that our client had picked the child up and carried it off after he'd called police. So it's just a little absurd to think if you kill a body and have it in the trunk of your car, or you've hidden it somewhere, that you're going to call police before you get rid of the body. None of this makes sense that you would do that. And so we think either he was abducted or somebody who'd had a little drink hit him in the roadway, panicked, and got rid of the body.
Do you think at the end of the day your client got a fair trial? When we talk about issues of appeal after the sentencing, were there issues that you felt your client didn't get a fair shake that you might raise on appeal? Is there going to be an appeal?
Yeah, there will be an appeal. I think the jury did the best job they could with what they had. I do think there were errors committed in the trial. I think some of those errors are reversible errors. We will be filing an appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeals, and it's our hope that we'll receive a new trial.
Let's talk about sentencing. So sentencing set for September. What are you looking for in terms of a sentence? Any witnesses you plan to call? And what we should be looking out for?
Well, the felony murder carries life in prison. There's no discretion with the court. That is the sentence that he'll receive on that. He would not be eligible for parole, I believe, until he was served a little over 52 years. The other cases, the judge could sentence him consecutively or concurrent. My guess is that at least one of those will be consecutive. So I anticipate he'll get a sentence of probably 60 years or better.
Any plans, any indication that your client will make a statement at sentencing?
No, it would serve no purpose for my client to make a statement. My client still doesn't know what happened to Joe Clyde. The aunt has told us that the door was not locked the night before. So my best theory in this case is that they went to bed, left the door unlocked, and that Joe Clyde got out. There was a neighbor's house across the road that he would often go to. Perhaps he was going in that direction, was hit by a car, or abducted. I don't know. I know David Mashburn, an investigator out of North Carolina, has picked up some pieces off the side of the roadway that he believes comes from a car, and I think law enforcement is looking into that. But this is a case where I don't think we're ever going to know what happened to Joe Clyde Daniels. If he was abducted, then he's not going to be in this area. If someone hit him in the roadway and panicked and took the body off, they're not going to come forward and tell us where Joe Clyde Daniels is. So it's one of those, it's hard for people to accept, but I don't think we'll ever know where Joe Clyde Daniels is.
Well, let me ask you this. What about Crystal? She's going to have an upcoming trial. My understanding was she was never going to testify against Joseph in this case, but she plays a critical role. What do you think about her role in whatever happened and her upcoming trial?
Well, I think if the state believes Alex's testimony, it would be hard for them to prosecute her, because according to Alex, when he came in, Joe Clyde Daniels was in the floor and apparently already deceased. Crystal Daniels was far away, hiding behind a cabinet. So she's charged, in essence, with failing to take steps to stop Joe Clyde Daniels from being killed by his father. And Alex's testimony shows clearly there's nothing she could have done. So you can't step in and stop someone from killing a child that's already deceased.
She also became a big part of this case because of motive. The idea that she was having an affair, that your client was upset about this, maybe even questioning if baby Joe was his son. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I think that would have been strong motive if someone had killed Crystal Daniels. I don't see that as motive at all in regard to someone killing one of the children. If your wife is having an affair, then you see what we see a lot in these cases, which is called manslaughter. You kill that spouse. So I don't think if he found out she was having an affair, if he found out she was going to leave him, I don't think that would be motive for him to kill a child at all.
How's your client doing, by the way, after the verdict?
He's doing well. He's anxious to start the appellate process, and I've told him we'll have to go through sentencing. We'll then have to argue a motion for new trial, and then we'll have to file the appeal. And he knows that that'll take time, and that if he gets a new trial, it would probably be next year at the earliest.
Mr. Lockhart, I want to ask you one other question about the behavior of your client. So outside the confession, the prosecution was saying that your client really wasn't looking for his son, that he was busy calling a community college about work, that he goes into this truck stop. He was acting erratic, a little strange. Can you speak about that, the behavior of your client, which became an issue in this case?
Yeah, when he went into the truck stop, you could see him showing a photo of his son to the people in the truck stop and asking them if they had seen him. So yeah, he's looking for his son. He stopped at a bus stop and asked the kids if they had seen Joe Clyde Daniels. He's driving very slowly around the area. And if you're looking for a child that you believe to be alive, you're going to drive slow to see if you see him in the woods, off the roadway, in a field. So that behavior, to me, he's looking for the child. Law enforcement had told him he could not search on foot because they didn't want him messing up the scent trail. So if you can't search on foot and you don't have a personal helicopter or airplane, the only way you can search is to drive around and look for the child. Now, after they put him back in the house, the fact that he's in the house waiting on news from law enforcement, I don't think it's unusual or sinister that he would be pursuing a job application that he'd sent in. He's got a wife and kids, and he needs to find a job to earn an income.
All right. Mr. Lockhart, appreciate you taking the time to talk about this case, and we'll be watching the sentencing along with all of our followers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
You too.